World politics is a very important aspect, but when it comes to environment and natural resources, it's rather more interesting. Now, you might question why we are studying environment and natural resources in politics. It is a part of geography. It's a very simple understanding that whenever we are talking about any of the resource, any of the environmental concerns, the governments play a major role. So understanding how resources are being allocated, how resources are being distributed, how they are prevented from being distributed is very, very crucial. So here we would understand some of the major aspects of those. So in this session, we would be focusing on what are common resources, the common property resources. We would be talking about global commons, which is the global property of everyone on this earth. We would be focusing on the geopolitics of resources, geopolitics of oil and water, and understanding the concept of rising environmentalism. So world politics has been important. There had been some of the major crucial things that had been changing the lives. Those are the wars that had occurred, the treaties after the wars that took place, the rise and decline of the powers. So be it the power of Hitler, be it the power of Mussolini, the rise and decline of the powers, the world wars, the treaties that took place after those, the era, the cold era that we have already covered in our previous lecture, and then focusing on intergovernmental relationships. Now again, this is interesting. Two governments would have friendly relations either when they are at par, or one of the government feels that they can derive something better from the other government. So there is where you have good relations. So maintaining good intergovernmental relations is very, very essential and crucial part of world politics. Beyond that, we also focus on two major and less heard concepts. Those are poverty and epidemics. These have been present in the society globally across the nook and corner of the world, but these have been less discussed and less talked about. So what we focus on, the issues of concern globally, are very, very important. The first is understanding the fact that you have a lot of cultivable area, but the area under cultivation has been declining over the years. Also, with growing urbanization and growing alternate means, the fertility of the soil is being reduced. Similarly, we have lot of grasslands which are overgrazed by animals, a lot of fisheries which are overharvested, affecting the environment. Water bodies are depleting. We have lots and lots of pollution that is coming up. We have limited food supply and growing number of population. So if we talk about the growth curves, in one of the theories of Malthus, it has been given where you have the growth of the population which is exponential. However, the growth of the food supply is linear. Now, how we meet those two gap is a big question. So definitely there is restricted food supply to a favored few. The next is understanding the impact of deforestation with growing urbanization and loss of biodiversity that is there. Also decline of the ozone layer in the stratosphere because of the industrialization and the impacts of industrialization, and rising globalization, or we could say rising of industrialization, has given way to higher temperatures through global warming, and this has led to submergence of the coastal area. So depletion of the coastal landscape is again an important question. So these are some of the major questions which have been there for a global concern. It's not just a concern of one nation or two nations. It is a problem that occurs across nations globally. With a population of nearly 1.2 billion, which is residing in the developing nations, with lack of facilities for sanitation, more than 3 million children die every year due to starvation. You have a significant loss of human life that is occurring because of these issues that we have addressed as of now. So that's why we say it's not just geography, but it is more to do with the politics. How government can take steps, how government can take good steps to ensure that each of its citizen has ample of food to survive. Similarly, we are also focusing on the consequences that are there due to poor implementation implementation of these policies. We'll take a very simple example from Uttarakhand. In the recent days, we have witnessed numerous landslides in Uttarakhand. You might question why the probability or the proportion of landslides have increased in the recent years to a significant level. The simple reason is the EIA, or the Environmental Impact Assessment. The laws have been bypassed. Now let's say there has been the concepts of constructing tourist circuits, development of roads. So if there is a road which is 900 feet long that needs to be constructed, what has been done? The EIA gives the permission only for 100 feet, for example. So what would be done is, when it's just 100 meters, the project would be broken down into smaller projects. Each of the project would be completed at its own, so that the basic rule of the EIA or the environmental impact assessment is bypassed, and you have a construction that occurs. Now with this construction, what would happen? The ecology of that region would disturb, and as a result you would have more significant landslides that would be witnessed, affecting the existing ecosystem of that region. And this is where politics come into play. So we need to understand how these things actually work on the ground. So these concerns, as we said, are global. These concerns are environmental, but execution is what comes through the governing bodies. Now, who causes the degradation is a big question. Definitely, we would understand that in a while. The north and the south divide. North, the industrialized nations, are the global north, and those are producing more pollution as compared to the developing nations. Then who is paying the price? Definitely the developing nations are paying the price at the cost of the works being done by the developed nations. Also, who is responsible for the right action to take place, and who would take a leading role to rectify all this what is happening? So those are some of the major questions that come to our mind when we discuss this. So under this environmental concerns, let's understand the four major concepts. The first is the limits to growth. Now the Club of Rome, which is a global think tank, published a book in 1972, and this book was known as Limits to Growth. Now limits to growth talks about the rate at which the resources are being depleting in contrast to the population that is growing. So definitely you had numerous developments that were there in light to understand that our resources are limited, but the population that is using those resources is growing up exponentially. The second development came with Our Common Future, which was under the Brundtland Commission report, and this said that the traditional patterns for economic growth that are taking place are not sustainable, and if we keep on moving with the same pace, the growth is not sustainable. There is a rising demand of the South for the Industrial Revolution, and if that occurs, what would be the scenario? Right now, it's just the few nations which are industrialized, and if that industrialization expands to the developing regions, what would happen? Exactly 5 years later, to Our Common Future, you had the Earth Summit in 1992, which was the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and this focused on the major impacts that could have. The global north had a very different agenda to put in contrast to the south states which were poor and the third world nations that were there. Now here you had more than 170 countries, thousands of NGOs and multinational corporations who were part of this Earth Summit coming in together to decide what would be best for the Earth as a whole. So here is a kind of global thinking that started to come up, and finally it was brought about that the northern states, so if I have the map here, I can say these are the states which are the states of the north, these are the states of the north. Okay, and this north that is there is the developing region, and in contrast to this you have the south, which is the north which is the developed region, and the south which is the developing region. So far industrialization has its root in the north, but slowly and gradually now south is rising the demand for more industries, and if that continues, you would have a significant proportion of carbon dioxide and emissions into the atmosphere, which would ultimately affect the common life. So there need to be a relationship that must be demarcated between economic growth and environmental management that should come into play. Again, there was Agenda 21 that came into light, and this Agenda 21 was nothing but focusing on economic growth with environmental conservation or ecological conservation. So promoting economic growth along with ecological growth or ecological conservation was something that was brought under this, and this focused on an interdisciplinary approach for climate change, biodiversity, and forestry, and many more related aspects. Now, when we are talking about this environment, there are two things that we commonly hear of. One is the global common, the other is the common property resource. What is the difference? Global common is a thing that is meant for everyone. So we have four elements under global common, which is also known as res communis humanities. Now, res communis humanities focuses on four regions which is accessible or which is meant for every individual on this earth. Those are atmosphere, ocean, outer space, and Antarctica. They are no one's land. And there was various treaties that came into action to understand this. So there was a common consensus considering that these four regions would be considered as a global common. There was a higher understanding of the fact that there is significant inequality between the global north and the global south, that is the developed versus the developing nation. There needs to be the benefits of exploitative activities which are occurring in the north that should be granted to the developing regions as well. And with the discovery of the ozone hole in Antarctica, the whole story and the whole scenario changed. So from 1980s, when there was a discovery of the Antarctic ozone hole, it was realized that the benefits of the exploitative activities, not only from the Earth's activity but also from the outer space, must be either equally distributed or reduced across the north and south. So there was a kind of global consensus that came into play. There were numerous treaties that came into light. You had the Antarctic Treaty that came into play. Now with this treaty, we had the various region of Antarctica which was broken down into sectors, and as you can see here, you had Norway, UK, Argentina, China, and other nations who were trying to have certain territories. You had numerous research stations that came into play. India had its own research station, mainly the Maitri research station, which was established in Antarctica, and the whole of the region was divided under sectors. Now this was just the global commons that we have focused on. The next important thing that we have talked about is the common but differentiated responsibilities. Now common but differentiated responsibility focuses on the issues that the world need to discuss. So what is the role of the North? Now North focuses on more production, more industrialization. So definitely there are environmental concerns. So North is ready to address the issues of environmental concerns and progress for ecological conservation. But the South feels that there is still way for development to take place. So more of industry is yet to come, more industrialization yet to come. So they have more scope now for industrial growth, and they do not want to think of environment at the same pace as the North is doing. So in light of all this, you had Kyoto Protocol that came into play. So when in Earth Summit 1992, you focused on the common but differentiated responsibilities of the North versus the South, there was a very important question: what kind of role each of these nations will play. So North came up with more environmental concerns. However, South realized that they have a huge way to go forward for industrialization right now. So initially it was North which ratified the Kyoto Protocol. However, countries like India, China, which were developing, were left to join the Kyoto Protocol. Later in 1997, India believed that environment is crucial and we have the historic roots of environmental conservation that are there. So we proceeded to join Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and share on the historic, economic, and social responsibility as a nation. So if we focus on India's role, we have the huge history of Sherpas, which talks about deep ecology, conserving the nature, protecting the nature, and managing the sacred grooves that exist. And that's what led us to ratify basically the idea of Kyoto Protocol. Now, as we said, these developing nations which are there were allowed to have some time before they joined, but ultimately each of those would have to share the responsibility, but it would be differentiated in the sense that there could be a time gap, there could be a proportion gap, or the amount gap that could be registered in the contributions of the north versus the south that could be there. So per capita emission rates would vary, and there could be tiny fraction of the developing nation as compared to developed nation that could be there. The next important concept that we need to understand is the common property resources. Global commons, as we said, talked about the properties that is available for everyone. Common property resources represent common property for a group of people. Let's say people living in a village have well as a common property, has panchayat as a common property, have forest area as a common property. People living in urban area might be say a tube well or a hand pump is a common property for the people of the community. A garden is a common property resource, and that's not your personal resource. It's meant for a group of people who would be maintaining it, who would be looking after that, and who would be using it as well. So there are rights and duties with respect to nature that each of us have to bestow. Whenever there are certain resources which are given, there could be privatization associated to it, there could be government interference associated to it, but whatever be the scenario, these resources are meant for common use, so they must be maintained and managed properly, and these vary in the size and the quantity that they are available. Now when we talk about the global scenario, we have focused on how the crucial issues of forest, water crisis, deforestation have occurred across the globe. But when we focus on India, India's picture is not far different. If we look onto this map, we would understand most of the India is water stressed. So most of the region which you can see here marked in dark red is the region which has acute water shortages, and that is due to rising agriculture, mainly pertaining to the two eras of green revolution that occurred, followed by a vast expansion of urbanization and industrialization taking place. And then we also have a higher amount of carbon emission that is rising. So it's believed that on an average we would have a significant rise in carbon emissions by 2030 that would be there. Now besides this, what are the ways under which we are trying to curtail the rising problems in India? We are trying to move towards renewable sources of energy. So moving towards solar energy, wind energy, tidal energy is one of the ways. We are focusing on auto fuels, so moving towards BS6 norms, where we are talking about reducing the levels of pollution into the atmosphere. Energy Conservation Act, which was passed in 2001, is again important, that talks about more energy efficiencies. Moving towards LED bulbs under the Ujala scheme is again important. Similarly, India has been providing world with a global perspective, and even the Southeast nations with the SAARC nations, to understand the common position for environmental growth and environmental understanding. So India has been focusing with numerous environmental movements. One of the major movement occurs with the forest. So you had the Chipko Andolan in the north and the Apiko Andolan in the south, and this was hugging of the trees to protect the cutting of the forest. Now this was not just a movement that was popular in India, but you had national, international ways through which forest movements have come up, mainly through the local tribes, the indigenous people who have been residing in those regions. The reason being, it was their land, and if they do not have land, they would be displaced and they won't have the livelihood they have right now. So they would have to move for an alternative earning source. So definitely forest was integral part. A good example comes from Philippines, where you had protection of eagles and protection of the birds of prey from extinction that took place. In India, you had conservation of Bengal tigers. In in Africa you had conservation for elephants that was there. So you had numerous such efforts that were taken across globe to understand how the forest movements have been linked to the indigenous and the common people. The next important is the concept of mega dams. Now mega dams focus on building huge infrastructure for water supply, water availability and electricity generation. But this, in light of construction, displaces numerous population that is living in the associated area and the related area. So it was first when it started with the development of the dams. The first anti-dam movement started in the region of Australia, in the forests of Australia at the Franklin River. Later on, similar agitations were seen globally. In India, one of the most famous agitations that you must have heard about is the Narmada Bachao Andolan, and that was because of the displacement of the tribal people, rising height of the dams that leads to seismic or tectonic disturbances on the ground. So that was another important issue. The third important issue to address is the mining. Now mining is again very important and crucial part of the primary activities. With opening of the mines to multinational corporations, there was an excessive extraction from the earth, higher use of chemicals, higher use of compounds that was taking place, and higher amount of pollution that was going into the waterway. So there were anti-mining movements that started because they were clearing the normal vegetation of the tribal areas, displacing the local communities from their roots, and therefore campaigns started. Again in Philippines, you had Western Mining Corporation from Australia, which started to have its expansion in the region of Philippines, received severe agitations from the people of Philippines on the wake of the losing land and the native community that started to bring in challenges for the corporation that started to had more plans for development there. So what we need to understand is definitely these movements occur where there are resources. So three resources that we talked about was the forest resource, the mining and the water resource. Now whenever you have resources, you have the geopolitics that occur. Now geopolitics occurs in a very crucial and an important way. What happens and why it happens? First of all, one of the nation has numerous resources that stockpile. Other nation is thirsty or is hungry for those resources. So that nation would try to have more resources from your nation. The next is either there would be a military occupation to get more resources, or he would expand hands for friendship. So there could be a friendly relation between the two governments so that the resources are distributed, or there could be a military expansion in order to gain control over the resources. Also, there could be growing support from multinational corporations and other international organizations to complete this perspective. So we have a separate class that we have covered for geopolitics that has taken place. Now, we are focusing on who gets what, when, how and where. So expansion of this power leads to rivalry. There has been a more challenge that has been occurring over the years. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to ensure the supply of resources that remains crucial and remains accurate over the years. So what we need to understand is it's not just the resources. Beyond resources, let's say oil has been a major story in the regions of Gulf. You have a huge amount of reserves. 64% of the oil reserves are in the Gulf nations, of which only 30% is produced. So there has been constant clashes to acquire more of the regions, more of the territories to gain control over the oil-rich resources. With changing scenario now moving from oil economy to renewable resources, this scenario has been shifting. Similarly, you have water conflicts. Now these water conflicts could be international conflicts. Let's say Brahmaputra river is a means of conflict between India and China, Indus river between India and Pakistan. But on the other hand, you also have Kaveri river where you have interstate dispute within the states of Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Now here is how we have the disputes. Always a state or a nation which has the higher or the upper riparian region from where the river originates would have a stronger position because they could control the flow of the water, or they could manipulate the flow of the water coming in. So there has been constant clashes for water. Similar clashes have been seen in the regions of Euphrates river. So you have the Tigris and the Euphrates river in the Persian, which have witnessed numerous conflicts because of water issues since centuries that have been there. India's example we have already discussed. In Israel, you have attempts on the Kalmuk river and the Yarmouk river and the Jordan river, which have been a major conflict over the years. So there is where we need to understand that this geopolitics is very, very significant, and nations across the globe are trying to conquer either the less powerful nations, or they are trying to conquer or establish their supremacy on the nations which have more access to the resources, or create a friendly hand with those nations. So this is how governments and their relation work. The next is understanding indigenous people. Now, indigenous people defined by US are the descendants who have a right to a local population and a local habitat. They are there with a different culture, a different ethnicity, and have a uniqueness. In the worldwide scenario, we have nearly 30 crore indigenous people that are there. A differentiation or a kind of classification of those people across regions have been given here in summary, which is important. Now, these people have their roots. Now, what would happen when any development project comes in? They are displaced from their roots. So, their livelihood is lost, their lands are lost, and in wake of that, they are given certain proportions to displace. And therefore, you have so much agitation and so much environmental movements that come into play. So the World Council for Indigenous People was formed in 1975, and this focuses on the growth and the development for the various 11 indigenous NGOs that are running to protect the rights of the indigenous people. This has been popular in the regions of Central Asia and across globe. Thanks a lot.